Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso and we'll be talking about another discourse from the suttas today. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll go through the sutta and then take any questions at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So this is a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 4, sutta number 14, which is called here the Sangvara Sutta, the discourse on restraint. And this is particularly a explanation of right effort, the sixth aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, Samavayama, which is defined here in terms of its four aspects. So the no, this is something else. This is not the four right efforts. This was the four right efforts. Correction. These are the four right strivings, not the four right efforts. I was thrown off by the translation here. So the four samapadana, not samavayama. Okay, different thing. So these are four things in relationship to sense restraint. Okay. So I'll read through the discourse.
It's not related to sense restraint, only the first
one. Okay. Anyway, it's a discourse on four ways of training the mind. So I'll start reading through the discourse and give some explanation, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So the Buddha says, monks, there are these four strivings, these four padana, which means the application of effort or endeavoring or attempting to do something. So the four strivings. What for? So the striving to restrain, the striving to abandon, the striving to develop, and the striving to protect or preserve. And the first one, he says, what is the striving to restrain? And he says, here when a monk sees the sight with their eyes, they don't get caught up in the features and details. So, na nimittagahi, na bhyanjanagahi. So, nimittagahi means grabbing at the characteristics of something. And anubhyanjanagahi similarly has the meaning of grabbing at the details. So fixating on the details and characteristics of things. And the Buddha continues, he says, if the faculty of sight were left unrestrained, harmful, unwholesome qualities of covetousness and displeasure would overwhelm the mind. For this reason, they practice restraint, protecting the faculty of sight and achieving its restraint. And then the same for the other five senses, so ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So this is one of the standard descriptions of sense restraint that we find in the suttas, which it starts with this statement of when having any kind of sensory contact, not to fixate on the characteristics and details of that sensory contact. It's important to understand that this doesn't mean going through life in a blurry, hazy, unclear way. But rather it's talking about the fact that when we have a sensory experience, what we normally tend to do is we tend to look for the aspects of that experience which are either particularly pleasant or particularly unpleasant. For example, when you look at a person, you might fixate on some aspect of them that you find particularly pleasing. Maybe you really like their eyes or their hair or something. So you'll tend to fixate on the pleasant aspects of their appearance. Or conversely, if you find a person unattractive, unappealing, then you might fixate on the aspects of their appearance which you find unappealing. Maybe you don't like the shape of their hands or something. So you find some aspect, some detail to fixate on, which either increases your desire or increases your aversion. Or maybe you're eating some food and perhaps you really like some aspect of it. So the mind then fixates on the flavor or the texture as something that you really appreciate. And so that fixation on a pleasing detail then will increase the desire in the mind. It will increase the tendency towards obsession and fixation in the mind. Or conversely, you fixate on something you don't like. Maybe it's not salty enough, or maybe it's too salty, or maybe it's too spicy, or maybe it's too hot. Like the mind finds something to complain about, something unpleasant to fixate on. So fixating on particular details and characteristics here is talking about the tendency that we have to find the particular aspects of something, which is either inflaming our desire or inflaming our aversion. So instead, when we talk about sense restraint, again, sense restraint doesn't mean that we block off our sensory experiences, but rather it means that when we're having a sensory experience, we don't let the mind fixate on details which inflame our defilements. So we don't let the mind get caught up in things which will strengthen our desire and aversion. So we're still aware of our sensory experience, but we're aware of our sensory experience in a restrained and peaceful way, rather than an obsessive way, driven by desire and aversion. So that's the first samappadana. The first right striving is the effort to restrain our sensory experiences so that we're not constantly fixating on pleasant or unpleasant details. So another aspect of this, by the way, is that it means having a complete sensory experience. So to be aware of everything within our sensory domain. So without giving preference to the pleasing things or preference to the unpleasing things, instead we have a complete awareness of what's actually going on, characterized by a mind of equanimity. So then the second samappadana, the second right striving, it says, in what monks is the striving to abandon? It says it's when a monk does not tolerate a sensual, malicious, or cruel thought that has arisen, but instead gives it up, gets rid of it, eliminates it, and obliterates it. They don't tolerate any harmful, unwholesome mind states that have arisen, but give them up, get rid of them, eliminate them, and obliterate them. This is called the striving to abandon. So this also is a very important element of our practice. So sometimes you'll hear people say things like, you just need to be mindful. Everything's okay as long as you're mindful. It's okay to be angry as long as you're mindful that you're angry, and so on. But the Buddha said something quite different. The Buddha said, actually, when we recognize that there's something unwholesome going on in the mind, that there's some kind of harmful mental process occurring, so whether it's anger or hatred or craving or desire or anything of that sort going on, then we should recognize this is harmful. This is like poison in the mind. This is like a bonfire burning the mind. This is something which, if not controlled, it's going to damage my mind further. It's just going to cause more suffering to me and to the people around me. So then recognizing that there are these harmful, unwholesome thoughts going on. So he gives 3 examples: sensual thoughts, malicious thoughts, and cruel thoughts. Then these kinds of thoughts, we should try to destroy them as quickly as possible. Eliminate them from the mind. Bring the mind to quiet and stillness, or alternately to deliberately cultivate wholesome thoughts, such as thoughts of loving kindness. And actually a great discourse for this is the Vitakasantana Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 20, where the Buddha gives 5 strategies for controlling one's thinking. controlling one's thoughts. 5 strategies for eliminating harmful thoughts and cultivating wholesome states of mind instead. Yeah, so once again, it's not sufficient just to be mindful of unwholesome mental states and thoughts. We should also make a sincere effort to eliminate them. Then the third one, the bhavana padana, which means striving to develop, says, what is striving to develop? He says it's when a monk develops the 7 awakening factors, the 7 factors of awakening, which in Pali is bojjhanga or sambojjhanga. So the 7 aspects of our practice which lead towards awakening. And the 7 factors of awakening are actually a really good outline of the basic requisites necessary on the Buddhist path. So those 7 factors are, first off, sati, mindfulness. Second, dhammavicaya, which means investigation of Dhamma or investigation in accordance with Dhamma. Third one, virya, which means energy or effort. Fourth one is piti, which means euphoria or ecstasy. Fifth one is passaddhi, which means tranquility or serenity. Sixth one is samadhi, which means concentration or mental unification. And the 7th one is upekkha, which is equanimity. So these 7 aspects of a practice, which a complete practice for awakening. So mindfulness, investigation, energy, euphoria, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. These 7 factors all work together to bring the mind towards full awakening. And the Buddha says that these 7 factors are, they all depend upon seclusion, dispassion, cessation, and relinquishment. So these are these factors of awakening are nourished by seclusion. So seclusion means both in a literal sense of spending time alone. So instead of constantly socializing with other people, constantly hanging around other people and engaging in conversation and activity with other people, instead spending time alone. Because in silence and solitude, we have the opportunity to turn the mind inward and focus on developing these 7 aspects of awakening. And also seclusion in the suttas also has the meaning of isolating the mind from unwholesome tendencies. So secluding the mind from sensual activities, but also from sensual thoughts. Secluding the mind from any kind of harmful mental activities. And it says that these 7 bojjhangas also rely on viraga. So viraga means dispassion. So when the mind is not getting passionate about things, it's not getting obsessed with things. The mind is not getting wrapped up in the things of the world. Then it has the opportunity to focus on cultivating one's spiritual practice. So dispassion is one of the centrally critical qualities of Buddhist practice, which naturally inclines the mind towards unconditional happiness. The third one, it says it relies on nirodha, which means cessation. So cessation, fundamentally cessation of one's defilements, cessation of one's unwholesome tendencies of mind. That's the most direct meaning. Cessation also has a broader sense of referring to the tendency of all things to arise and disappear. So this could also be taken as referring to cultivating the awareness of the arising and ceasing of phenomena. In particular, paying attention to the disappearance of phenomena, which happens every moment, every single phenomenon within our awareness disappears. It's replaced by something else. So paying attention to the cessation of experience moment after moment is something which also inclines the mind towards letting go, towards awakening. And he says that this practice of the seven bojjhangas culminates in relinquishment. So vosaga parinaming. Parinama means it reaches its conclusion. It reaches its highest peak in vosaga. And vosaga means relinquishment or letting go. So letting go of all things, letting go of all conditional phenomena, which then allows the mind to attain full awakening. And then finally, the fourth one is the striving to protect or preserve. And so the Buddha says, what is striving to protect? He says, it's when a monk maintains a meditation subject that is a suitable object of concentration. And interestingly enough, here he gives as examples corpse contemplation, which is a bit peculiar that he chose that one in particular, but it's always good to remember that every discourse we have of the Buddha is the Buddha talking to someone in particular or a group of people in particular. So probably whoever he was talking to, the corpse contemplation was something that they were doing or practice that was useful for them in particular. But it's only one of many different meditation subjects that the Buddha recommends. So in the suttas, we find most commonly the Buddha recommends mindfulness of breathing or mindfulness of the body. He also very frequently recommends loving kindness meditation or the other Brahmaviharas, compassion, appreciation, and equanimity. He also very frequently recommends cultivating the perception of impermanence and the perception of non-self. So the Buddha gives many different meditation subjects in the suttas, many different ways of cultivating the mind. So the point here is whichever meditation object one is using, one makes an effort to keep that well developed in the mind, to keep the mind focused on one's meditation practice. So this also is very important. So not losing contact with our meditation practice. So both during a period of meditation, we want to really keep the mind well focused on our meditation object, but also as we're going throughout our activities, as we go throughout our day, we want to preserve our contact, protect our contact with our meditation object so that it stays fresh in the mind. So then when we return to formal sitting meditation, then the mind can more quickly and easily immerse into our meditation object. So that's the end of the description of the four padana, the four aspects of striving. And the sutta concludes with a very short poem, which, like most poetry, it loses its poetic quality in translation. But it says, here it says, restraint and giving up, development and preservation. These are the four efforts taught by the kinsman of the sun. Kinsman of the sun is one of the names of the Buddha. It says, any monk who keenly applies these may attain the ending of suffering. So that's the end of the discourse. We can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll take any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to all the people joining in online. Hello to Jay, Ned, Rebecca, Richard, Louisa, Karuna, Jayanta, Yankee, Michael, Bhante Kusala. Hello, Bhante. Sud, Chittapala, ARS, John, and Rebecca. Welcome to all of you. And Michael has a question. Michael says, doesn't the Bahya Sutta invite us towards a vivid connection with the senses as a path towards awakening? In hearing, let there be only the heard, etc. That's not the point of the Bahya Sutta. And also sense restraint doesn't mean not having a vivid connection with the senses. So sense restraint means not fixating on specific details and characteristics, which inflame desire and aversion. So the point of the Bahya Sutta actually is to, first off, to not add complication to our senses. So in the scene, let there be just the scene. In other words, when aware of a visual object, don't add any extra thoughts and ideas and perceptions and desire and aversion to that experience. Just be aware exactly of the sensory experience that's happening without adding anything to it. That's the first aspect of the Bahya Sutta, is don't add anything to your sensory experience. Just pay attention to the actual raw, unfiltered, unaltered sensation. Then the next statement the Buddha says in the Bahya Sutta is, he says, there's to see that there is no me here, and there is no me there, and there is no me in between. So he's also talking about cultivating anatta sanya, the recognition of non-self in relation to one's sensory experiences. So recognizing that there is no seer and there is no seen. There is no me seeing that. It is not, that is my sight, my object. But rather what we're observing is a natural process unfolding. So the Bahya Sutta, it's not about having a vivid connection with the senses per se, but rather it's about, well, first off, not so stopping the process by which we layer unnecessary complication onto our senses. So the papancha process, the process of complicating our experience. And second, developing the perception of non-self in relation to the senses. That's what the Bahya Sutta is about. So that would also fit within sense restraint. So the Bahya Sutta is not saying anything different than sense restraint. Rebecca says, which Majjhima Nikaya Sutta has the strategies for abandonment of unwholesome thoughts? Number 20, Vitakka Santana Sutta. And Sud says, what should be one's meditation object when one is engaged in activity? Is it whatever one is engaged in, or is it something else? Generally speaking, mindfulness of the body is always appropriate. It's always accessible. It's always useful. It's always relevant. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, always to be fully, clearly aware of your body's sensations. That's pretty much always relevant. And John says, how do I not get caught up in nimittagahi? So that means grabbing at the characteristics or details. When it seems things are flying into my mind quickly. Better to just look down when walking around. Actually, looking down when walking around is very useful. I recommend doing that anyway. Helps to keep the mind peaceful. So, of course, when crossing the street, you should look up and look around. But generally speaking, like, if you keep your gaze more restrained, then your mind will be more restrained. As for things flying into the mind quickly, well, that's just how life goes. Sometimes the mind just seems to be bombarded with so much sensory data that it's hard to get the mind to be still, to be relaxed. Well, in that case, you can actually observe the feeling of being overwhelmed with sensation. Just observe the chaos in the mind. And you'll find that in observing that sense of overwhelming chaos, that there's actually a peacefulness in observing the chaos. You can find that place of peace, which is observing the sensation of being overwhelmed. And of course, you should come back to mindfulness of the body. That's always useful. And Bhante Kusala says, I hear you use the word euphoria in the context of jhana, and here as well. In that jhana talk I listened to, Bhante said something like, no euphoria, no jhana. Kindly explain, Pali word. That Pali word is piti. So piti, I normally like to translate as euphoria. So piti meaning this very powerful, intense feeling of pleasure all throughout the body and mind. When the mind is in deep concentration, when one's samadhi is very strong, then one's body becomes extremely pleasant, becomes full of this intensely powerful, pleasant sensation, which in Pali is called piti. And I think that the word euphoria is a very accurate and precise translation of the word piti. It's commonly translated as rapture, but I actually don't think rapture is a particularly good translation of the word piti. Because rapture in English has a different connotation, which really misses out on the euphoric aspect of piti. Anyway, good to see you joining in online, Bhante. And it looks like the last question online. Anything from the residents here? No? Okay, so we'll go ahead and, there's another question here. Scott says, the preserve instructions suggest paying close attention to the details of a meditation object, which seems to conflict with the instructions on restraint. Is point to be mindful of Vedana? So focusing on one's meditation object means whatever it is that you've decided to use as your meditation object, your subject of meditation, to focus your mind there, because that's a way of cultivating concentration, cultivating mindfulness and concentration. So this has nothing to do with sense restraint, nor is it in conflict with sense restraint, because you're deliberately training the mind in a focused and precise attention, as opposed to sense restraint is more about going against the tendency of the mind to constantly bounce around, to constantly be distracted by sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. The tendency of the mind to constantly get wrapped up in desire for pleasant sensations and wrapped up in hatred towards unpleasant sensations. So sense restraint is about training the mind to be aware but unaffected by sense experience. So cultivating a sense of peacefulness and equanimity in relationship to sensory experience. Whereas the cultivation of a meditation practice, you've chosen something in particular that you want to hold the mind steady on. So that also is a training of the mind in restraint, but it's restraint focused on a particular object or particular subject or particular activity. So it's still in the category of restraint, but it's restraint focused on a meditation object. So it's not in conflict with the instructions on sense restraint. As for your question, is the point to be mindful of Vedana? I mean, mindfulness of Vedana is one possible meditation practice that one can do. So that would be one example. But that's not the sole point here. Yeah. And John says, is Dhammavicaya Sambojjhanga a reflective practice? How is it cultivated? I don't know what you mean by reflective practice, so you would have to explain that. But Dhammavicaya, so the term vicaya literally means exploration. So vicaya literally means going around or going through. So vicaya has the sense of exploring or investigating or analyzing. And Dhamma, the word Dhamma has a range of meanings depending on context, but normally the two common meanings are, one is Dhamma in the sense of the teachings of the Buddha, and the other is Dhamma in terms of phenomena in general. So all things are called Dhammas. So investigation of Dhamma can then either mean paying attention to our experience in terms of the Buddhist teachings. In other words, observing impermanence, observing non-self, observing the Four Noble Truths, and so on. Or it can mean investigation of phenomena in the sense of paying close attention to whatever experience is currently in front of us. So How's it cultivated? Again, it's cultivated through seeing our experience in terms of Dhamma, seeing our experience in terms of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, non-self, to see our experience through the lens of the Buddha's teachings. And ARS says, would sense restraint make you detached and lose joy in life if you do not develop happiness through samadhi? Sense restraint does not make you detached or lose joy in life. On the contrary, it makes your mind very peaceful and happy because the mind is no longer being pulled around by sensory experience. So the mind is no longer being constantly agitated and disturbed by sensory experience. So actually the mind becomes more happy and more peaceful when you practice sense restraint. Of course, that helps if you develop happiness through samadhi practice, as you mentioned. But sense restraint itself already cultivates a peaceful happiness of mind. Yeah, I've noticed a lot of people think that sense restraint is depressing, but actually it's the opposite. It's the opposite. It actually makes the mind very happy and calm. And Karuna says, are the four supports, seclusion, fading away, cessation, and ripening, sequential and dependent on the previous one? So here you're talking about the bojjhangas. They actually do seem quite sequential now that you mention it. So cultivating seclusion, based on seclusion, it's easier to cultivate dispassion. Based upon dispassion, it's easier for one's defilements to cease or for one to perceive cessation, depending on how one takes the meaning of cessation in this context. And then that ripens in relinquishment and letting go of all things. Yeah, it actually works quite well as a clear 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence. So yeah, I would definitely say that that's an accurate understanding. I would also say that each one of the four supports the other three, but that it does function very well as a step 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence. Yeah. HPD says, how's sense restraint practice? It's great. That's how it is. Yeah, it's delightful. And that's the last question. So I think we'll go ahead and end it this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you this evening for monk chat.